"You can't be serious, Erica. That's not your place," my dad said, his voice cutting through the conference room like a knife. I straightened in my chair, willing my hands not to shake as I looked at him across the table. "With all due respect, Dad," I replied evenly, "I wouldn't be making this suggestion if I didn't believe it was the best move for the company." His expression hardened, but I refused to back down. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. My name is Erica Landstrom, and I was 28 years old when this all happened. I worked at my dad's oil and gas company, Landstrom Energy, a giant in Houston's corporate world. Growing up, I always knew this company would define our family. It was my dad's pride and joy, the empire he'd built from the ground up. But while my older brother Scott was groomed to inherit it, I was always on the sidelines. It didn't matter how many degrees I earned or how hard I worked. My dad never thought I belonged here. Still, I refused to give up. If I was going to earn his respect, I'd have to fight for it. When I first joined Landstrom Energy, I didn't expect an easy ride. My dad made it clear from the start that my position was more of an indulgence than a necessity. "You can join the company," he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair, "but don't expect any handouts just because you're my daughter. Prove yourself." At the time, I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration and eager to learn. I didn't mind starting at the bottom. I wanted to. I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could show my dad that I wasn't just there because of my last name. I spent my first few months learning everything I could about the company, from the gritty operations at the refineries to the high-stakes negotiations in the boardroom. But no matter how hard I worked, there was always the shadow of my older brother, Scott. He didn't start at the bottom like I had. Scott was handed a senior executive role right out of business school, despite having no practical experience. While I was running reports and shadowing middle managers, he was sitting in on-board meetings, making decisions that would affect the company for years to come. It didn't seem to bother him that half the executives whispered behind his back about his lack of qualifications. He was my dad's golden boy, and that was all the validation he needed. I stayed late most nights, poring over financial reports and industry data, trying to absorb as much as I could. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Landstrom Energy wasn't as untouchable as my dad and Scott seemed to think. The oil market was changing, and the company was lagging behind. We were relying too heavily on aging infrastructure and outdated practices, ignoring the growing push for sustainability and innovation. I brought it up during a team meeting once, suggesting we allocate more resources toward renewable energy. Research. "Renewables?" Scott scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "This is oil and gas, Erica. You can't just slap a solar panel on a rig and call it a day." The room chuckled, and I felt my cheeks burn, but I held my ground. "I'm not saying we abandon oil," I replied, my voice steady. "But the market is shifting, and if we don't adapt, we'll fall behind. We need to think about the future." My dad watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. When the meeting ended, he didn't say a word to me, but later that evening I found an email in my inbox, a request from him to prepare a detailed report on renewable energy trends. It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd acknowledged my ideas. It was a small win, and I clung to it. The email became my lifeline, a chance to prove myself. I spent weeks compiling data, conducting market research, and interviewing industry experts. Every free moment I had was dedicated to that report. When I finally handed it to my dad, my hands shook slightly. He took it without much reaction, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. "This is thorough," he said, finally looking up at me. "I'll take a closer look and let you know." It wasn't exactly glowing praise, but it was enough to keep me going. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. I convinced myself he'd tossed the report into a pile of forgotten paperwork. But then I overheard him mentioning some of my recommendations. During a board meeting, he didn't credit me, of course, but the fact that he used my ideas at all felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, I felt like I had a sliver of influence at Landstrom Energy, It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew I couldn't stop there. I'd have to keep pushing, proving myself, and earning my place in a company that had never been designed for me. Over the next 6 years, I worked harder than I thought was humanly possible. Promotions didn't come easy. Every step up the ladder was a battle. While Scott breezed into new roles handed to him on a silver platter, I had to fight for every opportunity, proving myself over and over again. By the time I turned 25, I was leading small projects, managing budgets, and making a name for myself among the younger executives. It wasn't just about the work. I had to navigate the unspoken rules of a male-dominated industry. Being a woman, and my dad's daughter no less, meant every mistake I made was magnified, every success downplayed. But I learned to let my results speak for themselves. By 28, I'd earned a senior position in the operations division, overseeing some of the company's most critical projects. It wasn't the top, but it was close enough to taste it. Scott, meanwhile, had done little to justify his rapid climb. His decisions were often short-sighted, focused more on immediate gains than long-term growth. The cracks in his leadership were becoming more apparent. But my dad either didn't see them or refused to acknowledge them. And so, the balance of power remained until the day it didn't. That's where my story begins, the moment I finally stood up in that conference room, challenging my dad for the first time and setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The tension in the conference room was palpable as I finished laying out my proposal. My dad sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Scott, on the other hand, looked ready to explode. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "You can't seriously think Erica's idea is better than mine." I refused to let his outburst rattle me. "It's not about whose idea is better, Scott," I said calmly. "It's about what makes the most financial and strategic sense for the company. And if we don't pivot now, we're going to fall behind." My dad leaned forward, fixing me with a stare that could cut steel. "And you think you know better than the rest? Of us, Erica. Better than me?" For a moment I hesitated, the weight of his authority pressing down on me. But then I thought about the years I'd spent working to get here, the countless hours I'd put into understanding every facet of this company. I wasn't the same wide-eyed 22-year-old who'd just started out. I was ready for this. "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze head-on. "In this case, I do." The room went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. My dad's jaw tightened as he slowly leaned back in his chair, his steely eyes fixed on me. "We're done here," he said abruptly, his tone cold and final. "Everyone else, you're dismissed." Scott pushed back his chair, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "Good luck, little sister," he muttered as he walked past me, his tone dripping with condescension. I clenched my fists under the table, but kept my expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. As the other executives filed out, I stayed rooted in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. When the door clicked shut, my dad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. For a long moment, he just stared at me, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "Do you have any idea what you're asking for, Erica?" my dad said, his voice sharper now, almost a growl. "Do you realize how it looks when you challenge me in front of the entire team?" I held my ground, even though his tone sent a chill down my spine. "Dad, with all due respect, inside this building, I'm not your daughter. I'm an executive at Landstrom Energy, and in this room, I care about the company, not vanities or egos." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might explode. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "You think this is about ego?" he said, his voice quieter but still laced with steel. "It's about knowing your place. I've built this company from nothing, and I won't let you undermine that, with your need to prove something." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. "I'm not trying to undermine you," I said, keeping my voice steady. I know how much this company means to you. It means just as much to me. That's why I spoke up, because if we don't adapt, if we don't think ahead, everything you've built could be at risk." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a slow, measured sigh. "You're bold, Erica. I'll give you that. But boldness doesn't always translate to wisdom." He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "You've had your say. Now let's see if you're as good at following through as you are at making speeches." As he walked out of the room, I stayed seated, my heart still racing. This wasn't just about winning his approval. It was about proving to myself that I belonged here, that my ideas were worth something. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't backing down. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Rebecca Morgan, one of the few women in senior leadership at Landstrom Energy. Rebecca had always been someone I admired from afar. Sharp, strategic, and respected in an industry that wasn't exactly welcoming to women. If anyone could understand the challenges I faced, it was her. "So," she said, flipping through the pages, "of my proposal," her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly on the table. "You're suggesting we overhaul the refineries and invest in renewables at the same time?" Bold. "Expensive and necessary," I replied. "The refineries are bleeding money because of inefficiencies. We can't sustain that, and renewables, if we don't start positioning ourselves now, we'll be playing catch-up in a decade." She glanced up at me, her expression unreadable. "You're not wrong," she said finally. "This is the kind of forward-thinking this company needs. But Erica—" I leaned forward, sensing a but I wasn't going to like. "This place," she continued, her voice lowering slightly, "isn't built for women like us. You're smart, ambitious, and you've done your homework. But that's not always enough here. Landstrom Energy is an old boys' club. You can have the best ideas in the room, and they'll still dismiss you if they feel threatened." "I know that," I said quietly. "But if I don't push for this, who will? The numbers speak for themselves. They can ignore me for now, but they can't ignore the facts forever." Rebecca nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. And you're right. This company needs change. If you want my advice, don't let them see you falter. Be relentless. It's exhausting, but it's the only way." Her words lingered as I left the meeting. I knew Rebecca was right. This place wasn't built for women like us. But I was determined to stay, to prove I could navigate the maze and leave my mark on Landstrom Energy, no matter how many barriers stood in my way. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I threw myself into refining my proposal, incorporating Rebecca's feedback, and preparing for the uphill battle I knew was coming. Late nights at the office became the norm, and the stack of coffee cups on my desk grew taller each day. I could feel the weight of the company's future pressing on my shoulders, but I was determined not to let it crush me. One evening, as I was poring over market projections, there was a knock on my office door. I looked up to see Marcus Langston, one of our lead engineers, standing in the doorway with a tentative smile. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "Sure, Marcus," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "What brings you here so late?" He sat down, glancing at the spreadsheets strewn across my desk. "I've heard about your proposal," he began. "Word gets around. I wanted to say that I think you're onto something." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You do?" He nodded. "Absolutely. The industry is changing and we can't keep doing things the same old way. I've been working on some green technology initiatives on the side, but they've never gotten much traction with upper management." "Tell me more," I said, intrigued. We spent the next hour discussing his ideas, ways to reduce emissions, improve efficiency, even integrate renewable energy sources into our operations. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely excited. Here was someone who not only understood the challenges, but also shared my vision for the future. "Why haven't you presented this to my dad?" I asked. He gave a rueful smile. Let's just say your dad isn't exactly receptive to change, especially when it comes from someone like me, someone like you. A young engineer who's not part of the inner circle, he said, shrugging. But maybe if we combined our efforts, they'd have to listen. I considered his words. You know, that might just work. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and I collaborated closely, merging our proposals into a comprehensive plan that addressed both the financial and technical aspects of modernization. Working with him was refreshing. His enthusiasm was contagious, and his insights were invaluable. One afternoon, as we wrapped up a meeting, he looked at me thoughtfully. You know, Erica, you're not like most people here. Is that a good thing? I asked, smiling. It's a very good thing, he replied. You actually care about making a difference. I felt a warmth spread through me. Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot. As our professional relationship deepened, so did our personal connection. We started grabbing coffee together, sharing stories about our lives outside of work. He was easy to talk to. And before long, I found myself looking forward to our conversations, more than I cared to admit. But as things progressed, so did the challenges at work. My dad remained skeptical, and my brother was openly hostile. At a family dinner one Sunday, my dad barely acknowledged me, focusing all his attention on Scott's latest golf tournament victories rather than any business matters. Did you see the dip proposal Erica's been working on? My mom asked, trying to include me in the conversation. My dad waved his hand dismissively. It's ambitious, but unrealistic. We have a way of doing things that works. I felt a familiar pang of frustration. Dad, with all due respect, clinging to old methods won't sustain us in the long run. Scott smirked. Here we go again, he muttered. Little sister thinks she knows better than the rest of us. I took a deep breath, determined not to let him get under my skin. I'm simply suggesting we explore options that could secure our future. My dad set down his fork, looking at me sternly. Enough, Erica. This isn't the time or place. I looked around the table, seeing the tension etched on everyone's faces. It was clear that no matter how hard I tried, I was still the outsider in my own family. Later that night, I called Rebecca. I don't know how much more of this I can take, I confessed. It's like talking to a brick wall. Change is never easy, she replied gently, especially in a place like this. But remember why you're doing this. It's not just for them. It's for everyone who depends on this company, including all the employees whose livelihoods are at stake. Her words resonated with me. She was right. This was bigger than my family's approval or my own ambitions. It was about making a real difference. The next morning, I scheduled the board of directors. If I couldn't get through to my dad directly, maybe I could appeal to those who had a vested interest in the company's success. With Marcus and Rebecca's support, I presented our comprehensive plan, laying out the data, the projections, and the tangible benefits. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. Then one of the board members cleared his throat. This is impressive, he admitted. You've given us a lot to consider. My dad looked displeased, but couldn't refute the facts laid out before him. Scott, on the other hand, was visibly fuming. After the meeting, my dad called me into his office. You're pushing boundaries, he said sternly. Maybe it's time someone did, I replied. I care about this company as much as you do. I'm not trying to undermine you. I want to help secure our future. He studied me for a long moment. You're determined? I'll give you that. Does that mean you'll consider the proposal? I didn't say that, he cautioned. But perhaps it's worth discussing further. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. As weeks turned into months, momentum began to build. The board approved a pilot program to modernize one of our refineries, and initial results were promising. Employees started to see the benefits, and even some of the more traditional executives came around. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I ran into my dad in the lobby. Heading home, he asked. Yeah, it's been a long day, I replied. He hesitated before speaking. I wanted to say, you've done good work. The board is impressed. I looked at him, surprised. Thank you, Dad. He nodded, the slightest hint of a smile on his face. Perhaps it's time we started working together rather than at odds. For the first time, I felt a genuine connection with him, a glimmer of the respect I'd been striving for. Later that night, I met up with Marcus to share the news. Sounds like progress, he said, raising his glass. Slowly but surely, I agreed. He looked at me thoughtfully. You know, Erica, you've changed a lot around here, not just with the company, but with people like me who felt unheard. I smiled. I couldn't have done it without you. He reached across the table and took my hand. Here's to new beginnings, he said softly. As I looked into his eyes, I felt a sense of optimism I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to fall into place. As the months went on, the changes we implemented at Landstrom Energy started to take shape. The upgraded refinery exceeded expectations, reducing operational costs and significantly improving efficiency. The pilot program's success silenced many of the critics on the board, and even Scott had stopped openly dismissing my ideas, though his disdain was still written all over his face in meetings. My dad, however, remained a puzzle. While he began involving me in more strategic discussions, he still held back from fully endorsing me. I could feel his conflict, part pride, part stubbornness, as he grappled with the shift in dynamics between us. For every step forward, it seemed like there was always a lingering hesitation on his part, as though admitting I was right meant surrendering something fundamental. One day, Rebecca stopped by my office. He's testing you, you know, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I figured as much, I replied, setting down the report I was reviewing. But what more does he need to see? Results are results. Rebecca smiled knowingly. It's not just about the numbers for him, Erica. It's about trust. You're proving yourself to the board, the employees, even the market. But to your dad, this is personal. He needs to know you're not just capable of running this company, you're capable of carrying his legacy. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. And how exactly am I supposed to prove that? Rebecca stood smoothing her blazer. Keep doing what you're doing. Show him you're not here to take over. You're here to lead. There's a difference. Her advice stayed with me as I continued navigating the complex web of corporate politics and family dynamics. Slowly but surely, I began to notice subtle shifts in my dad's behavior. He started asking for my input more frequently, occasionally deferring to my judgment in meetings. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress. The turning point came during a quarterly review meeting. One of our largest investors raised concerns about Landstrom Energy's future strategy, questioning whether the company was prepared for the challenges of shifting energy landscape. Before I could respond, my dad surprised everyone by stepping in. Erica has been spearheading initiatives to address exactly that, he said, gesturing toward me. Her work on modernizing our refineries and exploring renewables has already shown promising results. I believe her vision is what will carry this company forward. The room fell silent, all eyes on him, and then on me. For the first time, I saw genuine respect in his expression, not just for what I'd accomplished, but for who I'd become. After the meeting, as we walked out together, he placed a hand on my shoulder. You've earned it, Erica, he said quietly. Every bit of it. Those words stayed with me long after he'd left. They weren't a declaration of total approval or a formal passing of the torch, but they were a start. For the first time, I felt like I belonged, not just in the company, but in his eyes. That night I sat with Marcus, recounting the moment. So what's next? He asked. Next, I said, smiling. I keep going. This isn't the end. A year later, everything had changed. The board unanimously approved the full-scale implementation of the modernization. plan, and the company was on a trajectory of growth that few had anticipated. Investors praised the forward-thinking strategy, and Landstrom Energy began earning a reputation not just as a legacy oil and gas giant, but as a company with an eye on the future. Scott had quietly stepped back from many of his responsibilities, unable to keep up with the demands of leadership. He'd moved into a figurehead role, still holding his title but with little actual influence. My dad had stopped shielding him, recognizing that the future of the company required real competency, and perhaps finally seeing that Scott's entitlement couldn't substitute for skill. One evening, my dad called me into his office. It was late and the building was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights. He sat behind his desk, the weight of decades of leadership evident in his posture. "Sit down, Erica," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I took a seat, folding my hands in my lap. "What's on your mind, Dad?" He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You've proven me wrong," he said simply. "Again and again you've shown me that you have what it takes, not just to succeed here, but to lead." I stayed silent, letting him speak. "I've thought long and hard about this," he continued, "and I've made my decision. At the next board meeting, I'm stepping down as CEO, and I'll be recommending you as my successor." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. For so long, this moment had felt out of reach, and now it was here, handed to me not out of obligation, but respect. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "I won't let you down." He nodded, his expression serious but warm. "I know you won't." When the board approved the transition weeks later, it felt surreal. My name was etched on the CEO's office door, and the responsibilities that came with it weighed on my shoulders. But it was a weight I was ready to carry. That night, as I stood in my office looking out over the city lights of Houston, Marcus walked in. "CEO Landstrom," he said with a teasing smile, "has a nice ring to it." I laughed, shaking my head. "It feels surreal." He stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You fully deserve this, Erica." I turned to him, a calm determination settling over me. "This is just the beginning," I said. "The real work starts now." In the years that followed, my dad and I found a mutual respect we'd never had before, one forged through challenges, trust, and growth. Marcus became my rock, standing by my side as both a partner and an equal, sharing in the vision of what the company could become. As for Scott, he eventually stepped aside, finding his own path and giving the company the space it needed to thrive. And with that, I stepped forward, ready to lead Landstrom Energy into a future I had fought relentlessly to shape. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. And make sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.